you can develop a pretty decent barbell curl without much to show for it.
You can go years and years and years without training your triceps with tension in that position.
Actually, genetic freaks and beginners have a lot in common. He actually was using phenomenal technique, I would say, but half the comments were like, "What's this guy doing?"
You wake up tomorrow morning and all your arm gains are gone. What's your plan?
I don't think it would take long to get 17-inch arms.
So I'm going to kick things off with biceps. GVS, you said while preacher curls are a good movement, you'd probably program them with very good warm-up, keep higher reps, and even coach someone to not fully extend at the bottom, because at that point, it doesn't feel like biceps, it's more tendon. You've leaned more towards incline curls. Landon, in your bicep tier list, you have preacher curls as S tier. So I'll start with GVS. For an intermediate lifter watching, trying to pick one primary bicep movement, which one do you land on and why?
I would say I still prefer the incline dumbbell curl personally. I think that you get more range of motion at the bottom in terms of length of the biceps, but you're also kind of deloading the bottom a little bit. Now, it might be that you're not getting as much growth because you're not taxing that initial part of the range of motion as much. It's not like lengthened partially kind of thing. But I find that it's actually kind of nice in terms of just how it feels, that it's not super challenging very, very early on in the movement. Because I do find that initial little bit from like fully locked to starting a curl, I do find that personally to be hard on the elbows. Now, one of the benefits of being a natural lifter is your progression is going to be really slow anyway. And so it does give the elbows a pretty long runway to adapt. But you do have to be a little bit more conservative with them, in my experience. That doesn't mean it's a bad movement at all. It's just that I approach it a little bit differently than more of a mid-range, and certainly differently than a contraction-focused curl. On a contraction-focused curl, you don't really have to be worried at all. It's almost like a prehab movement for the elbows, I found. But for movements where it is taxing at that long sort of straight elbow position, I think there's a lot of fear mongering around that. Like, you see these compilations and people really say, "Oh, never do this movement." I don't feel that strongly about it, but I do think you need to listen to your body and be a little bit more careful with them.
All right. Landon, I'll move to you. I know you're going to talk about preacher curls, but maybe you can
We'll see.
mention what Jeff said first, and then your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so the preacher curl is obviously some bread and butter for me and the stuff I talk about. And I think ultimately it's going to probably have the highest ceiling of any curl variation out there. Obviously, there's some similar stuff that can take you a really long way. But as far as like just progression potential, which I find is misunderstood quite a bit, people talk like barbells are the only way to have a high ceiling or a lot of progression potential with a lift, but it really just comes down to stability, because there's always a way to just add weight to a lift, even selectorized machines and stuff. There's gym pins and whatnot. So I find that is kind of almost a useless topic as far as being able to add weight. But the thing with preacher curls is you can obviously continue to add weight without your form degrading, because your elbows are supported and you're locked in. I find that the nice thing about preachers is the resistance profile of the lift. So where it's heaviest and where it's lightest matches decently well with where your biceps are going to be strongest versus weakest. So when your biceps are more lengthened, they'll be a little stronger. And then obviously vice versa, when they're in a more short position, the weight's going to be a little lighter on a preacher. The thing about that is obviously it is a little bit of an extreme, because there's literally zero tension at the top of a preacher curl. So having something that's almost somewhat of a bit of a partial, even though it's technically a full range of motion, can be, I guess, somewhat extreme or somewhat limiting in certain ways if that's the only thing you're doing, or if you're earlier on in your training. So I'd agree with Jeff that the more like complete and well-rounded lift for biceps is an incline curl. So if you could only pick one, you can't really go wrong with that. But I would say for someone that's looking for a high ceiling, and someone that wants to go from like intermediate level or so into like, I want the best biceps ever and I want to get 18-inch arms, I think the preacher curl is a great option, and it's really hard to mess up too. It's really just about your setup and your range of motion, and then everything else kind of just falls into place.
You're just mentioning that the preacher curl, part of the reason you picked it is stability. And I know a lot of the lifts that you pick high on your tier list usually focus on stability. So can you maybe talk about exercise selection and when you emphasize stability and when instability may be better?
Yeah, so stability, the number one thing here is it allows you to have a lot of potential. It allows you to have a very high ceiling with a given lift. There's a lot of lifts that are very good that don't have a whole ton of stability, not a very strong opposing force, and there's always going to be a weak link. So those lifts are best suited with their own approach, trying to make like a little bit lighter weight feel heavier, or just to overall emphasize a slower and steadier progression. When a lift is highly stable, you can kind of strength max. You can push the numbers up because the strong opposing force and the stability, as long as the other things are in check and your setup's in check, you can be a little bit more aggressive with progression. So in terms of just using progressive overload as a measurement for your overall growth and progress, highly stable lifts make a lot of sense. They also have a high ceiling because you can progress them for a long time without stability or weakling really ever coming into play. So it makes sense to have, I would say, at least one per muscle group within a program just for the sake of measuring progress. Other lifts can supplement that and just complement it really well. Some people would call those maybe accessory lifts or put them lower in the priority status on their programs, but I think they just take a different approach. And you just obviously still want to equate intensity across every lift in your program. I know, Jeff, you mentioned something the other day. I think it was on your story where you said every lift is fighting to have its place in your program. So I think that mindset applies here too.
Yep, 100%.
GVS, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I approach it where you need a minimum amount of stability, and you do need to take a different mindset with every given lift. And when I'm approaching a preacher curl or an incline dumbbell curl or a spider curl or something like a Bayesian curl, if I was going to do something like a Bayesian curl, I mean, there was that study that used Bayesian curls. And when I first heard, oh, they're using Bayesian curls, I was thinking, man, that is bold. That is bold to try to standardize a Bayesian curl. For those of you who don't know, a Bayesian curl is when your arm is behind you. It's a single arm kind of curl. So it is theoretically most challenging at the very start of the movement, and you're getting to a very long muscle length. So it is on paper a really good movement, but being able to stabilize and standardize your shoulder position and your torso position and your elbow position and even your wrist position can help you get like a rep sometimes in space with a whole bunch of stuff going on. It's just a lift where it's so easy to progress a lot, but then you didn't actually put more tension on your biceps. Whereas a preacher curl, yeah, the shoulders can come up a little bit. Like you see some people where they're sort of starting like this with the shoulders hunched forward, and then they're getting this kind of action where their upper back is contributing. But for the most part, there's not really a whole bunch of other stuff that can come into play. Whereas if you look at a barbell curl, that's another really good example where I've seen some barbell curls where it was a lot of other stuff and not a whole bunch of biceps. And so, yeah, they're curling a plate per side, but it's almost like a weird underhand power clean kind of thing. And the eccentric's not controlled, and it's a lot of hips and spinal erectors and upper back. And so you do have to be a little bit stricter and honest with yourself on those lifts. But a preacher curl, I mean, if you put on a whole bunch of weight on your preacher curl, your biceps are going to be growing. Yeah.
Do you feel, either of you, that certain personalities are better for something stable versus something less stable? So, for example, will people potentially use stability as a reason to not push themselves as hard and maybe not as close to failure? Or do you think that doesn't play into it at all?
Yeah, well, I'd say there's two aspects to it. Like there's one where there are people that want results but don't want to train hard, and they're always going to figure some way to kind of beat around the bush. So you're going to have people that recently in science-based lifting, stability is that thing. Oh, this lift is optimal. I'm going to hyper focus on stability to basically cope with my lack of ability or desire to train hard. And that is obviously an issue for obvious reasons. Yeah, so as far as stability goes, there's also personality types with levels of obsession, or you could say neuroticism, about progressive overload. And I find that for people that are hyper fixated on progression and there's too much anxiety and they're too anxious with the whole aspect of it overall, for them they kind of have to use very stable lifts because they just won't be able to do anything that's unstable, because it's inevitable that they're going to mess it up. So if you give them something like a lateral raise, dumbbell shrug, anything that's not lengthened biased, highly stable, they will just chase progression and just ruin their technique. So those lifts absolutely have a time and place, but I just don't think there's a lot of people these days that just have been kind of in your ear for years, like, just, it's all about progression, that's all that matters. And it's really just one aspect of a lot of things that matter for stimulating growth. So it comes down to the personality type, I would say. But yeah, there are some people that fall into that category, but there's a lot of other people that fall into the opposite category, where they feel or the lack of stability as a reason to kind of not push themselves. So there's a lot of ways people will beat around the bush and hyperfixate on the wrong things. But yeah.
GVS?
Yeah, I can usually tell based on just watching someone train, not even for very long. Like, if you're coaching someone, you get a week worth of footage, you're like, oh, you're this kind of person, or oh, you're this kind of person. And then you have maybe a third in the middle who are, sometimes they go one way with one lift, one way with another lift, or maybe they're just spot on, right? They have the control, but they also have like the requisite aggression and ability to train hard. And if you look at, the top natural bodybuilders, they all train hard, but they all have like a requisite amount of control as well. Some people need the control, some people need that aggression, and you can tell just based on how they train usually. I mean, I've seen some people where you got to cut their weights in half or less. It's just, and then they don't really understand what's going on in terms of, oh, they're seeing, but I use the same weight on dumbbell lateral raises as you. Like, why are your delts way bigger? And they have a hard time really wrapping their head around that. And it's because the hips don't lie, man. The hips are very powerful, and getting them into play, even like 20 or 30% of hip power, I mean, it's just a game changer in terms of how much weight you can lift, but it's not putting any more stress on a given area. And a lot of the times they're an intermediate, they're very attached to the weights that they're going to be lifting. Maybe they're a little bit self-conscious even. You could see them looking over at other people, like they're looking over at the weights I'm lifting, I can tell sometimes, and I'm just ignoring them because I don't I don't care at all. And they're very, they're asking me what I'm lifting. They're very intrigued by like how strong other people are and stuff like that. And so they end up using weights that are too heavy for them, and then making less progress than they actually otherwise would if they use an appropriate weight. And so, yeah, they need to be humbled and okay, we're gonna be using like the 4 kilo dumbbells on lateral raises, and they're just like, what? Like these dumbbells are pink. I can't use these. And I'm like, nope, it's good that they're pink, and so that you can doubly humble yourself. And other people, they just need aggression, right? And so I'll give them like really stable movements and just tell them to like, okay, here's a chest supported row, destroy yourself, like have fun. So you're gonna be fine, but like just like push way, 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 way harder than you think you should or need to. You can tell they're just thinking. They're just up in their own head during the whole set. From the first rep, they're just like, oh, what's my body doing? They might not have an athletic background or something like that. And so I'm not necessarily harsh with how I word things, but I might say, okay, that looked awesome. Let's jump up and wait. And they're like, oh, but it felt a little bit hard. Yeah, but it looked really easy, and it's a movement that you can't mess up. So let's just go up and wait. And so, yeah, you have to look at the person. And this is where bodybuilding is just knowing yourself and that process of self-discovery. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is I think people just want like really clear answers instead of like the know yourself, which is the actual truth. So my main bicep movement right now is the machine preacher curl. I've been using that for the last 6 months or so, and I find I can progress pretty well on it, and it's a stable movement. But I have noticed like recently there was someone next to me. I think it's like 110 10 pounds for that, for like, I don't know, like 8 or something, 6 to 8, something like that. So the guy next to me put more than me. And even on a stable movement, his ass was off the thing completely. So it was still a full cheating movement. So I think people really need to understand. And I think this even talks about, like, we've talked about like torso dominant versus arm dominant before. It's like, you need to know what is the limiting factor in the movement you're doing. And you need to make sure that if it's a bicep exercise, that the bicep is your limiting factor. And if it's a tricep exercise, that the tricep is your limiting factor. So I think we spend a lot of time on some of the details, but like that's a basic thing that I think a lot of people who even watch our content and lift are missing. Either of you can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so simple. Like you need to be taking that muscle to failure, but a lot of people just aren't, right? They're hitting failure or what they perceive as failure for a movement, but it's not, the muscle's kind of just getting started. And this is where, yeah, you have to audit yourself. And this is where more stable movements that kind of make cheating less possible are probably a good entry point. And some of the basic movements are maybe that just not that good for beginners. So you look at a barbell curl, there's a lot going on, and it's very, very possible to mess it up. And there are certainly rewards if you get it right, but a lot of people don't, and then they blame their arm genetics and stuff like that. So it's one of those things where if you're arm dominant, you'll probably be okay. But I would classify myself as arm dominant, and even like 5-6 years into training, I only had like 16-inch arms. And now it's like 2 inches plus, maybe even 2.5 or so based on that leanness. And that came from isolation, right? So even if you're arm dominant, you still need isolation, and you still need to perform them in such a way that makes sure that those muscles are going to be the limiting factor and they're actually being taken to failure.
I think it's important to remember that when it comes to lifting and mastering a movement, where no matter how stable or unstable it is, there's always going to be some room for error. Like you said, Varun, with that machine preacher curl, there's going to be a little bit of room for error. It's like it can be the most stable, most locked in, simple isolation movement. But if you're coming way out of the seat and you're completely changing your technique, there's still room for error with it. So that's just something to keep in mind. But I think it's good to remember that you're bodybuilding and taking your muscle to your desired proximity to failure is just a very direct fight against your instincts. So if you're aware of that as you're lifting, I think that's just a total game changer. And I remember being younger, I was in like high school or something, and I was watching some Athlete X video, and he said the quote, "Get comfortable getting uncomfortable." And that actually clicked for me really well. And you can say whatever you want about Athlete X, but that quote went a long way for me as a beginner. And I think it made a genuine difference in my noob gains, my first year or two of lifting and just being able to train hard, even though it wasn't nearly as hard as I train now. It still did a lot for me. So I think just remembering that it will go a long way if you're constantly kind of thinking about that when you're earlier on, or at least even if you're not early on, but you're just trying to improve your training or break through a plateau.
So I think the moral there is that if you're getting any value from the Basement Bodybuilding channel, it's because of Athlete X. He gets all credit for that. But I think what's interesting there is, we're talking about kind of the limiting factor and that you have to do isolations. And I know, like, Landon, you've like caught some heat before, like, hey, chin-ups isn't an S tier exercise for arms. And I love chin-ups. It's probably my favorite exercise, but I think that's part of the reason. It's a lot of the people aren't limited because of their biceps. So it's not really like they might take the set to failure, but they have like 5 reps in reserve from a bicep perspective. So they're not really getting the growth that they would picking an isolation movement where they know the bicep is going close to failure.
Yeah, it's just minimalism versus maximalism. So it's like from a minimalist perspective, you could say the chin up makes sense because it trains your lats, your biceps, a little bit of forearms, and that's not wrong. It's true. But if you're talking about bodybuilding, which is by nature going to be more on the maximalist side, then you could say trains them, and odds are you'll get some growth, but is that going to be anywhere close to the potential or the ceiling that I actually want for my biceps? So that, yeah, it definitely comes down to, minimalism versus maximalism, I would say, in that case. And there's nothing wrong with minimalist training, but I don't think it has too much of a place in bodybuilding aside from certain kind of like more unique maintenance phases for certain muscle groups and whatnot.
Hear
Yeah,
you.
I mean, I think that works if you're a beginner or maybe a genetic freak. Actually, genetic freaks and beginners have a lot in common. And so someone will send me some video of like some street lifter who built impressive biceps off of only chin ups. And it's like, okay, yeah, but if you took 100 guys and they've already been lifting for a while and they tried to do that, it wouldn't work for the vast majority. Or some study will come out on untrained lifters and it said, oh, look, see, a curl and a chin up are just as good for the biceps. It's like, yeah, but their biceps being 3, 4, 5, 6 reps in reserve, if you're a beginner, like that's actually fine. Like it's not that big of a deal. But when you're more advanced, especially if you are not gifted in that area, and again, I'm pretty arm dominant and I have pretty decent arms. I did a whole bunch of dips and close grip bench presses and lots of pull-ups, and I even did some arm training directly. It just wasn't particularly high quality, and I was plateaued. So, and I would say I have better than average arm genetics. I think it's pretty safe to say. So, yeah, at a certain point, it'll stop working. Probably somewhere around intermediateville, 2, 3, 4 years into training, and to get over that plateau, you're going to need more specific work. It's going to need to be harder and it's going to need to be more precise as well. And so that's one of those things where you hear people plateau 2, 3, 4 years into lifting. That's pretty normal. That's pretty normal, but it doesn't mean it's a plateau that has to last forever.
Yeah. I actually have noticed a lot of I know you're saying people get like plateaued at the intermediate, but I find a lot of beginners who've been training for, let's say, like 4 to 6 months or less than a year, they're still not happy with their arm growth at all. Like they feel like it's lagging based on, I think, what they perceive. And I think it's because either they're doing this minimalist thing where they're saying, hey, it's just chin ups, or they're using too much weight and doing horrible form and they're not actually hitting the right muscle. So like either way, they're not stimulating their arms as effectively as they could be.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, part of it's just so sometimes the best path forward is to dip down. And it sounds so simple, but when your ego and your sanity really is tied up in progressive overload because we don't have a whole ton of other ways to measure muscle growth too accurately. And it's a slow process, so it's easy to kind of have a distorted perception. I mean, body dysmorphia is very popular in the fitness sphere. It's tough to humble yourself and lower the weight 10 pounds. Like it sounds like nothing, but when you're wrapped up in that process, it's much easier said than done. So having that skill to kind of be okay with taking a brief step back to take 2 steps forwards, I think is massive if we're talking about technique and just dipping down to get stimulus. And it's like that builds you right back up rather than just trying to like ram through the impossible brick wall with a fist.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where I think genetics play a role. I mean, they always do. I've seen people do starting strength and get to like 500-pound squat, mid 300s bench, and just, yeah, they're just like, yeah, I kept adding weight and like everything was cool. And then other people, they plateau in starting strength. They don't even hit a plate per side. I've heard of that. Like they were doing everything right. They followed the program and that they couldn't get past 1 plate per side on their 5x5. And so it's the same program, but it just worked vastly better for one person. And so this is where, I mean, you can audit the sleep and the nutrition and the training hard, that kind of stuff, and then genetics do play a role. I think specifically when it comes to arm training, there are just so many muscle groups that can take over. I mean, you can have a kind of crappy squat that is not great for your quads, but like you're still going to be working a whole bunch of muscles. And I guess starting strength, the point is not really muscle growth directly anyway, even though it's often used for that and marketed like that. But when it comes to arm training, yeah, like you can develop a pretty decent barbell curl without much to show for it. And so, yeah, a lot of people need to be humbled and they need to reduce the weight for sure.
Also, I want to take it back to you saying the person that has like good genetics and built like large biceps with just chin ups, like the person who just does calisthenics, for example. I think the amount of volume that they do is insane. Like they're doing it for fun. So if you're doing 100 sets in a week because that's all you do, then yeah, it's going to grow. So you can't use that in a bodybuilding sense where you have one person that's not tracking anything and just going hardcore because they're into this hobby. And the other one, you have someone tracking 3 sets a week or 5 sets and saying, hey, it's not giving me the same results. Like it's not the same game. Like they're doing two different things.
Absolutely. And this is where you hear advice like, oh, just get a 4-plate weighted chin up or something. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, oh, you want a big back? Just get a 12-plate deadlift. Like, okay, well, sure. You're not wrong. If you do get 1,000-pound or whatever deadlift, your back will be big. Okay, sure. But maybe there's a better way. Maybe there's a more sustainable or more orthopedically friendly way. I mean, I've seen some people with crazy dips and okay triceps, you know? And so with a lot of these big movements, they're just such a roundabout, difficult path to get to the goal that people want to get to. And so, and then it's often just so flippant. They're like, oh, just get a 4-plate chin up. Like, bro, just did come on. Like, I mean, that's a lot of weight. I mean, I have never done that. I haven't done like a specialization phase. And then people are like recommending 1 rep as well. That's another thing. Like, oh yeah, just one rep. But like you wouldn't train that way for hypertrophy anyway. So it's wrong with the rep range. It's wrong with the exercise. It's often wrong with the way people do it because they are again so fixated on the numbers. And so it's like wrong, wrong, wrong. And people might even hit that number and then they're disappointed with the result because they've not necessarily been lied to, but they weren't given the whole picture.
Any thoughts on like something like pre-exhaustion, like doing maybe biceps earlier in the workout and then doing that compound at the end? Maybe it'll be more of a limiting factor. Just any thoughts on that?
I'd say it usually does more harm than good, I would say, because there's probably the benefits of it are probably very, very limited. You could say maybe like load management if you want to make a light or a heavier lift feel a bit lighter, be able to get more out of lighter weight. But that's very unique cases, not really something I've ever wanted or needed to use personally.
Yeah, same situation. I don't use that often at all. I don't really feel the need to do it. I sometimes see it implemented, yeah, as like a you hear Lee Haney talk about how he would do his squats last and only use 300 or 400 pounds or something because he had done leg extensions and then leg press and then squats last. I think that if someone is enhanced, that makes a lot more sense. I mean, you look at most IFBB pros, they seem to love leg extensions first. It seems to be pretty much a staple. But I think that's just the poundages that they're using are so immense that it makes a lot of sense. And but for the average person, it's just not really needed. And I think if someone wants to limit the amount of weight that they're squatting, they can maybe just squat in a way that already does that, maybe more upright, perhaps even in a Smith machine, perhaps with the feet a little bit more forward, maybe a narrower stance, maybe with the knees going forward. Oh, it's a Smith machine squat. Oh, like you've changed the movement, but it's actually better for hypertrophy. So, and then when it comes to arm training, yeah, maybe instead of flinging the weight around, you can move a little bit more controlled. And a lot of this stuff you can do load management yourself without having to go through that whole process of like setting up and pre-exhausting. And I think that makes more sense for most people.
Cool. All right, I'm going to move over to triceps specifically. So similar to how we talked about incline curl versus preacher curl. Jeff, I know you do a lot of overhead tricep work, and Landon, I know you love the JM press. So maybe Landon, you can start this time and just talk about why you like the JM press as kind of your main tricep mover.
Yeah, for the JM press, I just find that it's such a unique lift. Like, you get so many lifts in a given bodybuilding program where, let's say you're doing your presses. You have a bench variation, whether it's a machine press or a barbell, dumbbell, whatever it is. You get pretty much max tension on the triceps around, for flat presses, about a 90-degree elbow bend. You can get more than 90 degrees, but there's not a whole ton more tension there, especially with the pecs being under a bunch of load, front delts too. Yeah, you can say incline presses, the steeper you go up into an overhead press, you get more elbow bend since it's just more range of motion, but there's not necessarily a whole ton of tension for the triceps in that position. So what the JM does is it just gives you, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. So when you look at tricep isolation lifts, it's really the same thing, whether it's a push down, a skull crusher, dips, whatever it is. You are basically getting peak tension either in the contraction or at 90 degrees. And yeah, you might be able to go past that and get more of an elbow bend. But when is there actually going to be max tension there? You always, when you look at the resistance profile of these lifts, it's always peak tension at 90 degrees or lower towards the contraction. So the JM press, what it does is it actually gives you max tension in these deeper elbow bends. So it's a very unique lift, and a lot of people will feel very weak in that position. Sometimes they'll actually be a little bit uncomfortable in the joint. Usually that's a very brief phase that it just requires you to kind of slowly progress through, and then you more or less have bulletproof elbows. It's been the case for myself and a lot of people that I've worked with. But yeah, with JMs, they're just such a unique lift to be able to get that range of motion and that much tension. Plus the stability aspect is super cool too, with the very strong opposing force. Push downs, anyone that's gotten pretty strong on those, they know it does kind of turn into an ab exercise at a certain point, especially if you have weak abs. Not going to name names, but myself in that case. So the JMs are pretty unique. There are it's not a complete lift. There are still other parts of the triceps and other functions, other resistance profiles and ranges of motion that you want to train as well. But it ticks a lot of boxes that most people's programs just don't even touch. Like, you can go years and years and years without training your triceps with tension in that position. So it's unique, and I think it's just a great overall mass builder.
Do you feel that overhead work is necessary?
Hard to say no considering Jeff is here, but I would say I would say overhead work is it's such an important position to be training in, but it's also incredibly easy to mess up because it does require a lot of mobility and a lot of just kind of awareness too. I find if there's any lift you need a mirror for most people, it's going to be an overhead tricep extension because the lift is done behind your head. I know people will kind of say jokingly that they have eyes on the back of their head, but most of us don't. So using a mirror to actually keep track of your elbows helps a ton. Using a seated stationary bench for back support helps a ton because you can lean into it, let the weight pull you back, and basically pull your lats and your shoulders into that position you need to. And I find that overall, most people are going to be too internally rotated. Their elbows flare way too much, and it turns into more of just like almost a JM overhead press in a way, rather than a true extension. So super necessary, wonderful lift. Too many people mess it up and they don't get the gains they should out of that lift.
Jeff, you want to talk about overhead work?
Yeah, so I would say it is my preference. Certainly known for my long head game. I do find that it is still mess upable, especially some variations. I use a few different variations. One is where I'm just standing vertically and then I'm extending overhead with a cable and a rope. And it is important to use a rope, by the way. This is one situation where I do think a rope is far superior because if you use a fixed attachment, either a bar or V-bar, it almost invariably turns quite pressy. So you start to either shrug up or you start to use just other muscle groups, front delt. It turns into like a triceps dominant press, which is probably still pretty decent for a lot of people, but you're not really like pulling. No, you want to be pulling and keeping the elbows high, and you might need to stretch out your lats even in order to really get enough range of motion and to keep everything in the long head of the triceps. And I've tried jam presses, and I could absolutely see their value. They tend to bother my left elbow a little bit, and so kind of what I've done as well, nothing replaces the jam press, but as a sort of workaround, I guess, is I've done like seated pushdowns with the elbows fairly flared, where if you're doing a normal pushdown, you're standing, yeah, it is like a mid-range to contraction focused movement. But if you flare the elbows and you have a fixed bar and you're seated with back support, especially, I do find that it is a lot more in that stretched position. And I do find it actually takes the long head of the triceps out of it a significant amount as well. Whereas if I do like a standing push down with a rope, I personally tend to sweep quite a bit with a little bit of lat and then with the long head of the triceps. And so I did find that being a little bit more punchy with that movement with a V bar. It's hard to say because I haven't really A/B tested, and it's hard to A/B test stuff in your training anyway. But I have found that maybe some of the benefits of the jam press have been bestowed upon me from that style of it's almost not a push down, it's like a push away as well. So it's not quite in the same plane of movement, and it's not as heavy, but I have found that it's a very different feeling from a lot of the other triceps work that I've done.
Yeah, it's kind of like that was a staple movement for me too on the arm series a couple years back. It was that pretty much just that
I
and
think I
jam.
actually got it from you. I think I actually got it from you.
It's I got it from other people too. It's been kind of like a lift that's really great, and obviously kind of that friction and that back support. So, buddy, helps a ton. Definitely very, very nice, especially once you get to a certain strength level. But yeah, it's a good lift, and the progression potential on that's very good too. But it's almost kind of like it's like a diamond push up in dip form, but you're doing it with like a push down attachment. It's a very interesting lift, but it feels great. And I think if you tracked your elbows back or flared or a little bit of both, it does give you more tension at the top. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. That's cool. So I'm going to move in a little bit different direction now. I'm going to just have maybe GVS, you can start. This is kind of a large topic here that kind of go together. What are your thoughts, just general framework for arms in terms of volume, best rep ranges, and frequency?
So I guess I'll start with the last one. I know some people say that, oh, it's just about the volume, frequency doesn't matter. Frequency is just a way to arrange the volume. Yeah, I don't necessarily believe that, and I do think that having more than once per week frequency for your arms is a good idea. They tend to recover fairly well for a lot of people. And so, yeah, I would say 2 to 3 times a week is probably a pretty good range. I've done twice a week with isolations for a very long time on their own day. And then you could say compounds are also a little bit of arms as well. So I'm typically at like 2 or 3 times per week frequency for both biceps and triceps. And I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. You could maybe go to 4, 5, 6 times a week, but I think if you can't grow muscle on 2 to 3 times per week for a given muscle, I'm not sure if going to 4, 5, 6 is always the play on the field. Like, I don't think frequency is necessarily your problem if you're already at 3 times per week. You know, if someone's like, yeah, I'm hitting quads 3 times a week, but should I go to 4 or 5? Like, okay, well, let's go. There's something else. Something else is going on. In terms of volume, this is a bit individual, and I'm certainly known for higher volumes, but I have toned it down a little bit because I found actually focusing a little bit more on quality and progression and just being more sustainable with the volume, was a better idea. I will sometimes still get in, a few sets per exercise, like 3, 4, 5, even if I'm feeling good. I tend to auto regulate, but I would say two to 3 sets is a pretty per exercise is a pretty decent recommendation. So 2 to 3 times per week frequency, 2 to 3 sets, per exercise. And then I typically like 2-ish exercises that are quite different in terms of their mechanics. So like 2 for biceps and 2 for triceps. In terms of biceps, I do like hammer work, so either cable or dumbbells. And then I also would want something underhand. And then occasionally reverse grip curls might make their way in, but they often get kind of by the wayside at this point. I haven't done them in a long time. But if someone wants a third curl for some reason, I think a reverse grip is also a pretty good idea. And then for triceps, it would be something push downy first, followed by something overhead second, typically. And so that's sort of my general structure. So like 2 to 3 times per week frequency, 2 to 3 sets per movement, 2 movements for biceps, 2 for triceps. And I think that's a pretty good framework that you could kind of try to tweak a little bit, but it's not going to be too far away from that, I think, right? Like 1 set once a week kind of thing, or like 40 sets for biceps, 52 sets for biceps. Like it's going to be somewhere in that range, I think, for most people.
Just one follow-up there. You say 2 to 3 times a week, but how many of those 2 to 3 times are you fresh when you're doing your arm workout? Because I think a lot of people might do twice a week, but it's like at the end of a full body day. So I'm just curious how you think about that.
So if they're a priority, I do think putting them early-ish is a good idea. That being said, I haven't put them first in a workout for a very long time. I've been doing upper, lower, upper run. And so the arm work is after a whole bunch of back and chest and overhead presses. And so I'm a little bit weaker. How much does that impact growth? It's hard to say. I can still perform and progress, but likely not as much as if they were first or on their own day. And so, yeah, I would say you're maybe sacrificing a little bit putting them later, but the vast majority of people should still be able to grow even after, compounds. And especially if they're doing their compounds in a way that are very torso focused anyway. So if you're doing a bunch of arcing pull downs and sort of chest presses that arc, that's not going to be a lot of biceps or triceps because it's just taking those muscles out of it. And so they should be fairly fresh enough that you can still train hard. And I think a lot of this is mental as well. Like you can still train hard when fatigued. And if you can't, that's mostly a mental thing, I think.
I want to push back on you just a bit there, GVS. I know you're saying, kind of being an advanced lifter, you can do your arm training at the end of your session and you can do it in a way that you're still progressing. I feel for people who have only been lifting for like a year or less, for example, like they really need to prioritize it earlier in their session, either with an on arm day or just making it a priority. Because just what I've seen is most people don't have that mental fortitude to do it at the end. And a lot of people will it ends up being more junk volume. So I just want to push back there a bit.
Yeah, I would say this depends on their goals. If they really want big arms, more often than not, I'm going to be running in an arm day, at least one, maybe two. I mean, I did 2 a week for many, many, many years, and it definitely worked. But it just depends on their goals. If they want more of a balanced physique, I think putting them at the end of the day, on an upper day or something, maybe even a push pull legs kind of thing, I think that's fine. Like you won't have a disproportionate physique as long as you're working hard at them. But yeah, a lot of people won't. And so this kind of just depends on the person and if they can get the job done. If they want big arms, then I might have an arm day. If they kind of want big arms, I might not. But then if we see the physique progressing and it starts becoming a weakness and we have to prioritize it more, then, maybe we switch things up.
Landon, maybe give your overall thoughts on those main topics there.
Yeah, so as far as arm training goes, I think it comes down to the person, your priorities, what you care about, and where your physique is at, and your overall training age, and then what is your split, and then kind of based on that, I'll figure it out from there. So if it is, say, let's start with the lower sessions per week. So if it's full body, I think the sweet spot's going to be one lift per muscle per session. So strictly talking about the arms here, one movement for biceps, one movement for triceps, 2 to 3 sets, great starting point, assuming 3 times a week. If it's 2 full body sessions a week, I'd probably opt for 3 sets consistently rather than that range. If we're talking upper lower, I would say doing your arms, you can still do them at the end of the session. In most cases, if your volume is moderate, if your volume's a little higher, that can obviously sacrifice some of that quality later in the session when you're doing your arm stuff. But I find that kind of the same thing there. I would opt for 3 sets rather than a range, just since your frequency is going to be at twice a week, assuming it's a 4-day upper lower split. And then beyond that, if we're talking like upper lower push pull legs, or just like a push pull legs variation, that's 5 or 6 days a week. With splits like that, you just have, it opens up so many slots within a given session. Like if you're doing a push day or a pull day and you're training 3 different muscle groups, give or take, you just have so many extra slots to add in variety. So in that case, I would say kind of dispersing your volume around makes a little bit more sense. So let's say you're doing a push day, you do 2 movements for the pecs, 1 or 2 for the delts. You got time and energy to train 2, maybe 3 movements for the triceps. I wouldn't do like 5 sets on each, but maybe doing 2 sets and then saving a little bit of that freshness for another movement and maybe doing 1, 2 sets on the third movement in certain cases. That can work totally fine. And that's more of like a kind of like a long-term end goal, I would say, for a split like that rather than something to start on. But as far as reps go, I've always found that I just default to the science and I use the 5 to 50 rep range for everything. No, reps, it depends on the lift. So for me, if it's more stable and it's something where you have that high progression potential, so preacher curl, JM press, slightly lower reps make sense because you're going to be more aggressive. So 5, sometimes 4 reps for preachers, I'll go that low. JM's a little funky going that low, but 4, 5 up to 8, maybe 9 makes a lot of sense for movements like that. Other stuff, good old 8 to 12 for something that you really want to make feel heavy when it's lightweight. Up to 15, 20 works totally fine too. So if we're talking like push downs or something with no back support or any type of bench you're seated on or whatnot, like I do genuinely kind of like sets of 15 to 20 with slightly slower, non-explosive concentrics. It feels great. And that's more or less my kind of arm training approach. The volume's not crazy. You can go pretty high if you need to. Like I wouldn't hesitate to do that if they are a high priority or they're a glaring weakness. But yeah, that's more or less it. That stuff's all fairly straightforward, I find. But it's stuff that people kind of they get lost in the sauce with it.
Do you think there's certain rep ranges where it's easier to go closer to failure if you're more of a beginner lifter? Like, for example, I find a lot of beginners who are trying to do like those 15 to 20, they're leaving more in the tank than they would if they're doing 6 to 8.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that burn that you feel is much stronger as a beginner. So I'd say like physically and mentally. So it's like physically, it's a much stronger sensation, and mentally, you're much less prepared to deal with it. When you're more advanced, like I don't get the same burn that I used to when I first started lifting. Like I there's a lot of times where I like if I didn't get a pump, I wouldn't even know that I'm training that muscle. It's like it's just kind of how it is. Not that I can't feel anything, but the mind muscle connection and this not necessarily just that, but the overall sensations are definitely more toned down. Plus, I'm also more mentally equipped to handle those situations now. So yeah, for beginners, higher up stuff, not always ideal if intensity is a higher priority, but it's also a good skill to learn. So there's kind of a double-edged sword there, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think I felt the burn. I would need to do something really weird to feel a burn, like a static hold for a minute and a half or something really weird. Like my wife gives me something I have to hold out to the side and, "Oh, my delt's burning," because it's been a minute and a half or 2 minutes. But weight training, I mean, even if I'm doing a set of 15, 18, 20, it feels the same as like a set of 4 or 5, 6, and it probably looks fairly similar as well. Maybe the higher reps are a little bit more grindable, but still feels pretty similar from my point of view. Like I don't get a different sensation really, and I think that's just part of lifting for a really long time. Could be a work capacity thing as well. You get someone where they're going from sedentary to starting to lift. Yeah, I mean, they're gonna have trouble with moderate rep ranges even. So, yeah, that doesn't, necessarily. I don't do like 25 and 30 reps, but I'm sure I could grow off of them. It's just like a little bit boring personally. So yeah, five to 5 to 50. I think it's actually 4 to 50 now. That there's been some talk of fours. I don't
We did
know.
it, guys.
And soon we're gonna be in Tripleville. Everyone's gonna be doing triples for hypertrophy. But yeah, I think 8 to 12 is a pretty good default for most exercises. Some a little bit lower, some a little bit higher. If if someone is out of the 5 to 15 range consistently with their arm training, something is a little bit strange, I would say.
Landon, we're gonna go with you here first. So you wake up tomorrow morning and all your arm gains are gone. What's your plan?
For lift. No, I would say I would probably start with my go-to lifts. So preacher curls, JM presses, I would ease back into those. And I think I would just keep it simple and just get the ball rolling. You don't want to go overkill at the start, but just something that you can consistently kind of focus on and basically put all your eggs into that basket and take very seriously. So I'd do one of those on either day. I'd probably stick to the split I'm on currently because I don't want to change things up. So it's a push-pull legs, push-pull. One little pro tip for people that feel like they are kind of very fatigued in their arms after a lot of torso work, you can train your biceps at the end of push day, triceps at the end of pull. Works for a lot of people. For some people, it's a maybe a little too much back to back with elbow flexion or extension, but I'd say for most people, they can train that just fine. And you get a fresher state, and you might get a little more stimulus too in terms of frequency when you're training your torso. But I would do that. So I would do JM presses at the end of my first pull day, preacher curls at the end of my first push, and then a good fun variation for the other sessions, push and pull later in the week. So that would be something along the lines of like incline push downs or an overhead extension, maybe like a pullover skull crusher hybrid to get some shoulder movement in there too. And then for biceps, I would probably just do some basic barbell curls, assuming I'm very weak and I'm not going to be using a ton of cheat or momentum. It's a fun, easy lift to set up, and I can kind of just gun it to big arms and curling 95 pounds, then probably move to another variation from there, I would say. So nothing exciting, but building big arms is the exciting part. The training for it is rather boring.
I guess the fun part is that progression would happen fast and you would see like major arm growth right away if you're starting at like 13 or 14-inch arms or something like that.
Yeah, do you think I could get like 17 inches in a year? Like, is muscle memory a thing, or am I literally starting from scratch? Your choice. You're the host.
Yeah, I think you're starting from scratch.
Okay. So, yeah, I don't know. I'd be very curious to see, knowing what I know now. I'm like, would I be able to dip back down as a beginner and just send it to like the stage I'm at now? Or would I go back to being a beginner and be like, whoa, I suck at lifting. I'm super uncoordinated and like it's a grind and I have to take a much different approach than I thought.
Yeah, I guess it matters, right? Like,
So we'll never
you
figure it
still
out.
know the technique, you still have the mind muscle connection. I would say yes to everything. You just have small arms.
Yeah, I would. I don't think it would take all that long then. I really don't. Like for when I got things super dialed in a couple years ago, I mean, I went from with a bulk, but I net gained an inch in arm size from 16 and a half to 18, cut back down to the same body fat, same weight, had an inch bigger arms in less than a year. It was 8 to 10 months. I'm like that. And that's at this stage of lifting. Like, I don't know. There's just new things you can learn. And once you just like figure it out, you just make a lot of gains really quick, and then things start to stall out and slow down. You get diminishing returns. But I think if I was able to do that as a beginner, like, I don't think it would take long to get 17-inch arms, for example. Maybe 2 years.
GVS, what do you think? Same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's really I've been asked that, oh, like if you had to go back and do it all over again, and it's really hard because you're putting your brain like in your old body or something. And I had a pretty similar experience when I really got in a routine and my technique was good and I was pushing it and my split was all set up and I was eating enough and wasn't in a super stressed state. Yeah, it was an inch on my arms in about a year as well. So, and that was as an intermediate. So, yeah, I think it's one of those things where getting your newbie gains and then keeping going. I don't know how big my arms were when I started. I should have measured, but I'm guessing like 12 or 13. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a couple years to be a little bit more conservative. It depends on your appetite as well. You got to eat enough as well. So yeah, it's in terms of how I would set it up, pretty similar. I mean, the main thing is not to do too much and then get burned out or to get injured and to be consistent. And so yeah, probably same lifts are very, very similar setup to what I did with the arm days. And I might add in some more like orthopedically friendly stuff. Like I've done some sort of single arm cable curls where everything is very much lined up. And so I might add in those. But yeah, for the most part, it would be the same stuff that I do now, just probably a lot lighter.
Cool. So it sounds like you wouldn't just do chin ups and rows, either of you, as your main mover to
I
grow your
mean,
arms.
I would probably do the wait. Do I lose just the arms? Like I have
Just the
everything.
arm.
I have
Just
everything
the
else.
arm. Yeah. Your back is super jacked. You have no arms. So that's the situation here.
Okay. That kind of changes things a little bit. I'm sure my movement patterns would be really weird, and it might take some relearning because right now I'm more arm dominant, and I'm trying to take those out of it. But then it would be kind of the opposite because I have these little toothpicks attached to my shoulders. So I don't know. It might be a learning experience. Like I might actually have to change a lot of stuff to get them back, right? Because if they're a weakness now, because when I took them from like 16 to 18, they weren't necessarily a weakness in my physique. They just became a strength. So maybe it's different from something being average to strength rather than weakness to back to where it was. So yeah, that might change things a
And
little
just to
bit.
be clear, you guys would hate how it looked more than you hated when you were new because it would look so fucking weird.
Yeah, you would be you would literally just look like a caricature of a power builder, more extreme than most people will end up.
And you know what the answer would be is like just add one more plate to your deadlifts. You'll get there, guys.
Yeah, yeah. Pulling 8 plates aside, 14 inch.
Do I get the strength of a power builder? Do I at least get the strength to
Sure, that's
like I
enough.
sacrifice the arms, but do I get the strength? At least people will
Only in
think I'm
sumo
natural.
deadlifts.
Yeah, only one lift.
So something we talked on a bit is these kind of two topics. We talked a little bit about resistance profiles, and then Landon, you kind of talked about like productive versus counterproductive momentum. You want to maybe just touch on those topics and if there's anything you want to add?
Yeah, so with cheating versus being strict, so using some momentum productively versus not using it productively, I'd say there's ways where you can use it to your advantage to kind of help you break through a little sticking point. And there's also ways where you can use it to kind of in a counterproductive way where you are just using it to make the movement easier and you're kind of missing out on the tension that you're actually chasing. So I'd say in some cases where, let's say you're doing like a super short biased lift and you need just a little bit more oomph to kind of grind through and get a good squeeze. So a really good example, this isn't arms, but you think about like most rows, they're naturally going to be a bit more short biased just due to the strength curve of them. So internally, you're going to have the greatest movement arm in the short position. So that's why when you're rowing, you fail at the contraction. And when you're pressing, you fail generally kind of in the bottom, maybe halfway up. But you'll find that you can kind of fight and grind a lot more on a press than you can on a row. You kind of just hit that sticking point and you kind of just fail from there. So for rowing, I find that using that momentum kind of allows you to smooth out that resistance profile a little bit. You can make the movement so it's heavier in the stretch, and so it's a little easier in the contraction. So if you're going so extreme to where you're just bouncing the weight, then obviously that's not really achieving a whole ton. It is very counterproductive. But if you're using just a little bit of momentum while still keeping tension on the target muscle, and you're using that just to make the contraction a little bit more just straight up doable, it can be pretty beneficial. So I wouldn't say it comes into play a whole ton with a lot of arm training, at least the stuff that I do, but I would say it's fairly useful for a lot of like rowing movements and maybe some other stuff as well.
Jeff, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I would say I cheat a bit more than Landon does, and this is where someone else might try to copy what I do and get worse results than if they just stayed strict, because I'm still trying to keep tension on the muscle. I'm still trying to start with the muscle and finish with the muscle. There just might be some other muscle groups coming into play to help through the mid range or to help to get to the contraction. And then it's essentially also overloading the eccentric, right? So if I'm doing, let's say, a rope push down where I might get the lats at the very start of the movement to try to like push it down. So it's not something that I could do slowly. Actually, if you look at Arnold train and pumping iron, a lot of his movements he couldn't do slowly. Like you see him doing pull downs and like he's like kind of ripping the weight, where you see him do rows, like he's using a lot of momentum in other muscle groups. But I can also see that he's doing it in a way where the limiting factor is still the muscle that he's trying to target. Right? Like when he goes up in a pull down, he's still getting a big stretch on the lats. And then as he gets to the bottom, he's still visibly contracting the back. And then maybe he could control the eccentric a little bit more. Personally, I would. But there's still that stretch and the contraction, the stretch and the contraction. And so if you're missing the stretch and the contraction and you're doing cheat reps, I think you're kind of missing the point. And so sometimes this can be a way to overload the eccentric or to get a little bit more weight to that contracted position, like in a lot of rows. And you do have to be a lot more in touch with a movement as well as just your body in general. And this is where it's a little bit more art than science. And so I think it can be a useful strategy, but it wouldn't necessarily be my default, just because if you're with someone in person, I think you can coach them to have them like get a lot out of it. But if it's online or if you're just like putting out a YouTube video on it, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to convey exactly how something should feel or exactly how it should look. Because the difference between good cheating and bad cheating, we'll know it when we see it, but someone might not necessarily know the difference if they see two different people do it. Right? Like I've seen people criticize Arnold, going back to Arnold for some reason. I've seen clips of him circulate on Instagram, and all the comments were like, "Look at this idiot." Like, what? What do you mean, look at this idiot? What are you
Bro,
talking about?
he's a Terminator, man. Show some
Yeah,
respect.
and so the idea that like any momentum is bad. So I'm doing overhead extensions actually, and he was using momentum, but it was still being limited by that throwing movement of the long head of the triceps. He actually was using phenomenal technique, I would say, but half the comments were like, "What's this guy doing?" So yeah, a lot of people they don't know the difference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the best way I could
Go
you
ahead.
go first.
Okay. I was just going to say, I also find that when you're using a little bit of momentum, it can be useful. So, for example, like if I'm doing tricep overhead with the rope, let's say I'm doing it where it's not straight up, but I'm kind of like forward. Like the bulk of the reps are going to be like really good form without any momentum. And as I kind of get near the end, I might use a little bit of hips to get it going, which I know helps me push the set further. But then it ends up being a little bit harder to track because I'm like, okay, how many did I do clean with no hips versus used a little bit of hips? Did I actually progress week to week? It adds a little bit of uncertainty from a tracking standpoint.
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely some of that coming into play, but I think one kind of thing that using more momentum and more cheat unlocks is, to touch on something that you brought up earlier, Jeff, is that aggression. There's too many people that are just kind of stuck overthinking technique, and they're kind of just very much limited by that. They're almost just kind of losing focus from that intensity and the aggression that they need. And I'm a fan of strict technique too, especially these days. Like I'm genuinely enjoying training very strict now, but yeah, when you watch someone like you, Jeff, or like say Arnold train, it's that the best way I can describe it is you're in the groove of the set. You're using the cheat in a way that's still controlled. So it's momentum, but you're choosing exactly when and how to use that momentum versus just using it to like get the weight from point A to point B, losing complete control, and then just trying to like catch it when it goes back down on the eccentric. So yeah, definitely a very like almost kind of esoteric aspect of training, but it's absolutely has its time and place. And for a lot of people, just training that way allows them to just unlock that aggression, get in the groove, and just like handle some weight, where a lot of people might be stuck kind of overthinking, worrying about the feel at every certain point of the rep. So that style of training, I think, it can at least teach you a lot about training intensity.
Yeah, there's a certain rhythm to it. Like, you look at, I guess, go back to Arnold, like, you see him do pull downs or something, and there's a rhythm to it, and, it's called pumping iron, right? Like, there's a certain sort of tempo to how the reps are going, and I do think that if arms are a weakness, this might not be the best strategy. So if someone that's been training a while, maybe they're an intermediate lifter and they have like 14 or 15-inch arms, they haven't really gotten a ton of development there. Cheat reps might not go great for them. Similarly, like for me, for lats or for chest, I don't really cheat anything because it just other stuff takes over and it becomes completely non-effective for those areas. And so for those movements, if I'm trying to target those muscles, I'm a lot stricter. But for me, on a triceps movement, like, I mean, where else is the tension gonna go, you know? So for me, on those, I can be a little bit looser with my technique, and they're still the limiting factor.
I was going to say, when I first started lifting, I trained with two friends and we took everything like to the forced reps level, which was like totally not necessary for arms. But it at least teaches you kind of like where your limit is, that when you kind of train on your own and kind of get deeper into this, you know when to push and when not to push. So I think that's kind of the challenge for kind of early on. Like the data shows like, hey, you don't really need to push yourself to quite to failure, and just make sure you have good technique. But you also need to learn that skill of aggression early on. So there's kind of a balancing point there.
Yeah, and this is again like looking at someone train is like the most important thing I would say. And I would suggest anyone watching this, if they're coaching themselves, video yourself. I think that is so valuable because it's going to tell you, are you getting slowing reps? Are you maybe using too much momentum? Are you not as close to failure as maybe you think? That kind of stuff. And I think one of the benefits of being a content creator is you film a lot of sets and you see a lot of sets and then you put them out there and like you get feedback on them. And I didn't really do much of that my first few years of lifting. I wish I had more footage from back then, but I think it would have helped just because it always feels way more challenging than it actually is, especially as a beginner. Man, that last rep took forever and it was like a second and a half or something. Yeah, knowing that you could be pushing yourself harder as well, I think is a big part of that. And you have to be able to see the set and remove yourself from the set by seeing the set later, not during the set.
Yeah, time goes by at half speed when you're lifting. So being able to just like see that crazy grinder on the hack squat, you're like, whoa, that looks like 2 reps in the tank, is a major eye opener. And then it might genuinely feel like you're going to 0 RAR, but when you see that and you look back and you're like, wow, like I actually have more to give. And then you kind of try it and it feels maybe harder than than you're used to. And over time, that 1 RIR and the 0 RIR just feels easier, and you build up the ability to kind of grind those reps out too. So yeah, couldn't agree more with how important filming your training is, because you are trying to assess things while under immense amounts of tension, discomfort, physically and mentally. It's just not as accurate as a camera that doesn't really have feelings and kind of tells you the objective truth.
I think it's like when people hear their voice recorded and they're like, what the fuck? That's what my voice sounds like. It's kind of like, what the fuck? That's what my lift looks like. It's kind of the same experience.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You're like, whoa, I thought my voice was much deeper. It's always a bit of an eye opener on camera.
I think we covered a lot of ground today. Is there anything major topic wise you think that we should cover, either of you?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Teach me how to do jam presses.
M's, elbow surgery.
I'll fly there. I don't care.
Yeah, we'll do an arm session. We'll do just JMs and preachers, and then next day we'll do incline curls and some overhead extensions. Sets of 5 to 50. Let's get it. Road to 19.
Sweet.
Road to 20-inch arms.
About 20 arms. So I'll finish today off with kind of a fun question here. Let's start with you, Jeff. What's your Mount Rushmore for underrated arm exercises and why?
Man, Mount Rushmore. So I get 4 of them.
Yeah.
Can I do 2 for buys, 2 for tries, or anything I want?
Yeah, anything you want.
Okay, I'm gonna say, actually, some of the West Side guys had some good stuff. You see a lot of their accessories for bench, and they focus on the triceps a lot because they were equipped powerlifters, and they had to focus on that last little bit of the range of motion. But you see some of them doing exercises you don't really see all that much anymore, like the Tate press, where you have 2 dumbbells, and this is probably worse than the jam press, but it might be more accessible for some people, where you just have 2 dumbbells, 1 in each hand, and you kind of have the elbows out, and then you're just bringing them down to the chest while trying to keep the elbows up. I've also seen them done where you're lying on the bench sideways, and then you're doing them sort of like that. I haven't tried those, but those might be good. So I'm gonna say sort of West Side Tate-ish presses with dumbbells are certainly underrated and could be a good option for some people. I'm actually gonna say forearm exercises. I'm gonna say that the slightly cheated overhead extensions, because I don't see them that much where you're leaned away and you can use a little bit of momentum. I think they do have a little bit more responsibility in terms of keeping them in the triceps, because you can use momentum. So that's going to be my second one. I don't see them all that often, and that's probably my number one long head of the triceps movement. Let's see. Let's do 2 for biceps. I mentioned Bayesian curls earlier. For me, the main issue with those is that the shoulder can do a whole bunch of stuff. So I think maybe stabilizing those where you're seated, and then you have the cables behind you is a good option, just because it's a lot more stable, and you don't have to worry about the scapula coming into play as much if you have back support, especially. I haven't done those a ton, but they feel pretty good. And then my last one, I'm going to say reverse grip curls. Not necessarily because they're going to be great for upper arms, but I think a lot of people, they just have lagging and lacking forearms. And I think having just a big, meaty forearm is something that, if you're lacking it and you have big upper arms, it looks a little bit off. And so I think having at least something for that. You see people use straps for everything nowadays, and I'm kind of moving towards that as well. So I think having something for the forearms, and it really is a pretty complete forearm developer. I find that they work most of the musculature involved. And so, yeah, probably a reverse grip, easy bar curl.
All right, Landon, your turn.
All right, so I appreciate you letting me go second, so I had more time to think. Very, very thoughtful of you. Thanks, Jeff, for being the guinea pig here. So, yeah, I would say for underrated lifts, there's definitely a few. I might have to go with actually 3 tricep lifts here. But what I would say is for triceps, the first one, this one's a little more boring, but I would say an overhead extension with back support I find to be quite underrated. I think a lot of people do the overhead, whether it's upright or whether it's leaning forwards, and those are great lifts when you do them properly. I would say most people just don't do them right. They do mess them up quite a bit. They're way too internally rotated. Elbows come out way too much, I find. I'd say for potential, those movements are great. But for a movement that is just kind of, I would say, a lower barrier to entry for most people, I think just a seated tricep overhead extension in a low back stationary bench. So bench that basically just looks like a chair for those of you that don't really know what I'm talking about. With these, you can scoot your butt forwards a little bit and lean back. So it's almost like an 80-degree incline, give or take. And then you can keep the bar overhead and just let the weight pull your elbows way up overhead. And the easy bar, if you're going roughly shoulder width or just inside, that keeps you in more external rotation too, since it keeps your hands more separate. So if you focus on tucking your elbows, you can stay externally rotated. I find that feels great for the long head, and just allowing that to pull you back into the maximum capabilities of your shoulder mobility, I find works great for the long head. And I think that's just a very underrated option, just because I think the positioning of that lift does get overlooked by most people that I've ever trained or watched train. So when you do it right, it works really well, but it's not exactly the easiest lift to get down because it requires a lot of mobility. It's a tough setup, and you can't see what's going on. Like, most people aren't doing it in front of a mirror. It's happening all behind your head. So tricky lift to get down, but the potential is unlimited, I would say. Next lift, I would say, is this is a more unique one, the slow push down. It sounds funky. It sounds very obscure, but doing the push down with no cheat and no explosiveness, I find is actually very grindable. So it's like a highly forceful, but a gradual acceleration through the concentric rather than just shove and then you hit a sticking point that you cannot fight. You lose all your momentum and then your rep just ends super quick. I find the last like 3 to 5 reps, especially the last couple reps, really just give you super slow, genuinely challenging, grindy reps. Best suited in slightly higher rep ranges, so 15, 20. The set's going to take a long time, but if you're intermediate or so, it's a great option because you can kind of push through that burn and that set duration just psychologically. So really cool option there. I would also say that another underrated one, I'm not going to go as far as to say a dumbbell pullover, although I do think it's a hidden gem for the long head of the triceps. I would say like an easy bar kind of PJR pullover style lift. For those of you that don't know, it's basically a combination between an easy bar pullover and skull crusher. So start at the top, like you're doing a close grip bench, basically. Lower it to wherever you prefer. Drop the bar behind your head. Allow your elbows to track back like this. And it's kind of just one fluid motion in the concentric where you're using a little bit of chi, but you generally want to keep it kind of controlled. Sneaky good lift there. And then for the biceps, my plan was to say reverse curl. Not going to copy Jeff. I'm not going to say that. So I'm going to have to get creative here. But I would say that it kind of boring. It might still be the preacher curls, the most
I knew
underrated.
it. I was waiting for the preacher curl. I was like, he's gonna say
I,
preacher.
I can't do it. It's too much at this point. I would say, I think I'll go with the strict curl. You can do them with a cable post. You can do them with a dumbbell with your upper arm braced against a post or a ball, whatever it is. Really good lift. Again, kind of similar to the slow push down. You don't want to be explosive because you're gonna hit a sticking point. But your goal, it sounds simple, is just to train elbow flexion. A lot of people focus too much on just getting from point A to point B, and I see this pretty much every time when I put these in a program. People will use cheat, they'll let their shoulder come off, then their elbow come off, just trying to get the weight above parallel. And I'm like, don't even worry about tracking your reps. Don't even worry about getting the full rep. Just maximally challenge elbow flexion. It doesn't matter how high up the weight gets. It's gonna gradually decrease as the set goes on. So it's just so difficult at the top. So just challenge yourself as much as you can and just keep things moving, keep the fight going. Who cares how many reps you get? We're already tracking with preacher curls, so it's just a go in, train as hard as you can, stop worrying about getting from point A to point B. And I think it's just mentally, it's nice to have a lift like that where you're purely just focusing on the muscle and there's no numbers that can kind of interfere with your short-term decision making within that set. So you're welcome for everybody that's sick of me talking about preacher curls.
All right, Landon, I'll go with you here first. Let's say you're someone who wants to grow your arms. It's your top focus, and you watch this video once a month, and at the end of the year, you failed. Why?
You didn't listen close enough. No, I would say it's probably, I don't know. I think we covered everything. I'm trying to think of what we might have missed, but I mean, we got the programming aspect down. I guess focusing on progression a little bit more might be something because we talked a lot about like the nitty gritty of getting stuff done. But I think a lot of what we talked about was almost like take a chill pill when it comes to progression a little bit. But I think at the end of the day, it is still important to realize your gains. Like if you built enough muscle to add a rep, like you have to take that rep when it's there to keep your stimulus high. So you can't force it, but when it's there, you have to be ready to take it. So especially on your stable stuff, preacher curls, JMs, whatnot, you have to take the progression when it's there. So don't expect to add a rep every time you do a set, every time you go in for that lift every week, but be prepared to. Don't be disappointed if it's not there. Like keep your patience, but one day that extra rep is going to be there and you have to be ready to take it. You'll get some signs like your final rep might feel a little bit easier than last week. Maybe instead of just failing immediately after your final rep, you have a little bit of a fight. You can at least attempt one. Then maybe the next week you have like an honest shot and a genuine fight to get that next rep. Then maybe you almost get it the next time and then you do. So that's one thing I'd keep in mind, but I think we pretty much covered
And
everything.
like a standard, like something like a double progression would be fine.
Yeah, double progression is great for arms. The two main progressions that I use would be a dynamic double progression. So just very, very quick. You don't have to overthink this for anybody listening. It sounds complex, but it's incredibly simple. A double progression means you're progressing two variables at once. Very simple. Within this, generally 99% of the time, it's progressing your reps in weight. So you'll start at a weight, focus on adding reps. Once your reps reach a certain number, you add weight, rinse and repeat that same cycle. Another one I like is all set rep floor. Kind of a unique one. Other people might have other names for this too, but for me, it's like I'll just say preacher curls. My rep floor is 6. Once all of my sets achieve 6 or more reps, I will add weight that following week. Simple as that. Don't sandbag. Don't go easy on your first set just to get 6 on your final set. Defeats the purpose of it, but that's just a general indicator of when to add weight, and you can milk those out pretty nicely.
Jeff, same question to you. I know it's late, so thanks for staying on, but why would someone fail if they're watching this every month and they really want to improve their arms?
Well, I think we should maybe define failure because I've certainly encountered people where they showed me their progress and they seemed like disappointed or sort of what happened, like what went wrong. But then I saw the pictures and like they actually did really well. And so sometimes it is just expectations. And I think sometimes this is just steroids, just straight up, like their standards are really, really strange. But realize that it's going to take a long time. Like you can do a lot in a year if you really buckle down and you nail the process. Listening to some guys on YouTube talk about it and then going in and experiencing it, it is a process. Like if we took our brains and put them into our bodies that had 13-inch arms, that's different from us describing our knowledge or like describing the process of what we would do. So a lot of it is getting in tune with your body and discovering what works for you. Like anything that we've said today, and correct me if I'm wrong, Landon, like anything we've said today, someone could do something different and that might be better for them than what we did. Like it is one of those things where there are so many paths to hypertrophy that it's kind of just a starting point. That being said, if someone didn't make any gains, like, yeah, they're probably just doing something. They're probably just not actually training hard enough or not eating enough at all, and they're skinny and they're already lean. And so it could be a number of things, but often it's just realizing that it is a long-term kind of thing.
Awesome, guys. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Tarun.